Senator van Turnhout.
Thank you, and you're very welcome, Minister. And I'd like to begin by endorsing everything that my colleague Senator Fiach has said today, and to thank him for all his work in the lead-up today. And I'm very honoured to be seconding this motion on behalf of the Independent Group, because given the experience of each one of us, I think we all have tales and testimony that we could share with this House. And Senator McAneill started by sharing us the figures from the Irish non-profit knowledge exchange of the number of people employed, the number of volunteers involved in community and voluntary organisations. And it made me think of jobs, and we regularly hear from the government that you cannot create jobs, but you can create the environment to sustain jobs. And I suppose I would say in the same way, I believe the government cannot create philanthropy, but I believe you can create an environment to encourage and sustain a culture of planned giving to charities and NGOs. And that's what we're about today, is trying to ensure that the government creates that and sustains that culture of planned giving. The report on the Forum on Philanthropy and Fundraising, I believe, is a very good start, and I look forward, Minister, to hearing your update on how are the recommendations being actually implemented, so I don't want to preempt that. But, Minister, I have a fear that, this report comes out and then each government goes back to their own department and then looks within their own department. When we know the reality, when we look at organisations, the reality is, as cuts are increasing, organisations are going from department to department. I could list several organisations here today that are funded from multiple of departments, and the departments do not know this fact, that they are funding, even sometimes funding organisations to do the same thing. So I wholly endorse what Senator McAneill has said about the need for proper and consistent data and evidence. Before I was appointed as Senator, I didn't know too much about the arts. I was very involved in the community and voluntary organisation sector. I was a spectator in the arts, but that was about it. But I think what we found striking over the past 2 years is that the challenges and the landscape are akin. They are the same. And I think the challenge for civil society organisations, for charities, is to realise that while our missions may differ, the environment in which we are working is similar. And I'm not even beginning to mention the challenge that we will have from sports organisations if the government, which I hope they do, brings in a ban on alcohol advertising for sports organisations. So there is an increasing challenging environment out there without even the recession. We see the exit of the philanthropists, mainly the Atlantic Philanthropies and the One Foundation. And the reality is that many of the non-profit organisations that I know from the children and youth sector are actually involved in delivering essential public services across the length and breadth of the country. And the Advocacy Initiative are developing a report, but one of the things they came out with a few weeks ago was to talk about the chilling effect. And it made me think, because a few weeks ago I shared, with the thanks of the Irish Times and the Irish Mirror, my critique on the development of the planned new Child and Family Support Agency. And following the publication, Minister, I was surprised by the level of correspondence and calls I received from organisations. They wholeheartedly agreed with me, but they didn't wish to publicly talk about it. The new agency has a budget of €545 million. Over 100 million of that budget will actually go to organisations and NGOs to provide services. But the new agency cannot yet define or even outline what these services will be, and so organisations are on tender hooks, nicely chilled, as they wait to see. These organisations have direct first-hand experience of working with most vulnerable children and could be invaluable advocates. And on the other hand, Minister, I have a really positive example from my own experience before I came to the Senate. As you know, I was Chief Executive of the Children's Rights Alliance, and at the end of 2006 we managed to negotiate with your own department for multi-annual funding, and from that we were able to leverage funding from the Atlantic Philanthropies and the One Foundation. And this is going to my point about the government creating a culture of planned and sustained giving. All too often we see government funding, actually organisations only find out in Q1 or Q2 of the year of expenditure what funding they will receive from the state. Which means no company, no business could operate in this way. How do you leverage funding then from corporate organisations, from philanthropists, from other people, when you yourself as a government aren't creating that culture? Minister, I think also, I should also say, when the government is looking, I think it needs to coordinate between the various government departments. We don't have information on state funding. How much does the state actually give in total to NGOs and charities? We have a Charity Act which needs to be fully implemented, and I have no doubt that my colleague Senator O'Brien will say more on this. But also the government shouldn't limit itself to how it can support the work of charities and NGOs through other ways, obviously through developing philanthropy, creating that culture, but also looking at public buildings, at school buildings, which are, in my experience, for youth work organisations, locked up every evening in many cases that we can't access them. So we have to hire commercial buildings. If we look at the valuation bill, Minister, the rates that are being charged differently throughout the country to arts organisations, to sports organisations, to youth organisations, that doesn't create an even field. On a positive example, Minister, I like to be positive as well, on the property tax, I made the case last December that charities that hold properties for hosting and accommodating activities for children and young people should be exempted from the property tax. And I'm very happy that Minister Noonan took on my amendment and brought the exemption into the property tax bill. So I think the government needs to create an environment to encourage and sustain a culture of planned giving to charities, and you do that by leading by example. You need a coordinated approach to funding. Currently, I believe there is a dearth of accurate and robust data on which to base public policy. This has been proven again and again, and Senator McAneill has really made the case for this. The state needs to be able to publicly and transparently account for how much it gives to each NGO and organisation. It needs to do that in a multi-annual way, obviously ensuring that outcomes are delivered on. It needs to invest in organisations to allow them to leverage and to plan for their outcomes. For me, this debate today is really a first step in looking at how we ensure that the challenges ahead can be faced together. And I am very concerned, Minister, that everything happens within a government department. An example I sometimes will give is on youth work. Who gives most funding to youth work in Ireland? You would assume it's the Department of Children and Youth Affairs. It's the Garda Youth Diversion Project still. It's not the Youth Service Grant Scheme. Now, do we wait for the problems to happen, or do we invest early? But by doing that, the government instills confidence. It says this is what it's about. It means when you go to organisations, you then can ensure that the government has to have a way of structuring, having structured vehicles for major giving. It has to have a social innovation fund so that we really can have this transformative impact and change that we all want. I read a quote there that said that sometimes we can decide governments on the ballot box, but philanthropy is a way that the public can decide what they wish to support and where they wish to see social impact. So what I'm calling on you today, Minister, is today is the start of a debate. We all realise, I feel many organisations feel they're on a cliff. We need to ensure that the government is working in a coordinated and planned way. And by doing that, helping organisations to work together, to collaborate. All too often I feel we're encouraged nearly to compete rather than collaborate. So for me, this is where we have to work together. I think you need to use the experiences that are here in the Seanad in particular. I think there are many senators who have active involvement in organisations right across the sectors that we have to work together rather than being just one sector, the community sector, the arts sector. That's not what it's about. Thank you.